learned a long time ago that Barbara Streisand has terrible stage fright and she has a mantra. And I figured if it works for Barbara, it'll work for me, which is that I'm very happy to be here and I'm very happy that you're here. So let's see if it works. Before I begin, I just want to say that this is my first time to the Aspen Ideas Festival, and I've heard amazing talks over the last few days, as you all have. But actually, what impresses me more, given that my topic is curiosity, are all the people that pay money and give up their time to come here and learn new information. That's quite startling. I met a woman yesterday at one of the talks who said that she had given tickets to the Idea Festival to her husband as a birthday gift. So you're the right audience for me to be talking about curiosity with. I'm going to give a kind of formal talk for a little while. I'm a professor, I can't help it. And then I'm going to stop and take, I hope, all kinds of questions, including your suggestions for good titles for my book. So I grew up on a farm on the eastern end of Long Island, New York, in a small village called Sagaponack, which in the Shinnecock language means home of the big nut. All around our house lay acres and acres of potato fields. That's me as a 3-year-old in one of the potato fields. When I was 3, I was given a red tricycle, which I used like a scooter because I hadn't yet mastered proper tricycle riding. I used it like a scooter because I wasn't old enough yet or sophisticated enough. That was in the early 1960s, and I had much more freedom than children do now. I was allowed to tour around the quiet streets of Sagaponack on my own. Besides farm equipment, only a few cars a day would pass through. And I had a daily round of visits I liked to make. First, I'd go see Mrs. Nichols, who lived in a white shingled house nearby. Next, I'd visit Ruth Hildreth, who lived 3 houses down and was our telephone operator. From there, I'd head towards the beach, which was about 800 yards further down the road, hoping to find my older sister or brother. But I rarely got that far. As I pushed my trike along the small lane with the warm tar under my feet, I'd almost always find myself stopping on the road's edge, drawn in by the endless potato fields that lined my route to the ocean. I'd park my bike on the grass. I'd crouch down on the edge of the field, as only a 3-year-old can do, with your knees up and your butt down, breathing in the sweet aroma of the pesticides, which mixed with the dry smell of dirt. And then I'd begin looking at the small potato bugs, which crawled busily towards the green leaves of the potato plants that lay in long, orderly rows as far as I could see. I'd watch mesmerized as their spindly, thread-like legs marched them forward, as if each bug was a small, wind-up toy. Then suddenly, with no reason I could ever discern, 2 translucent wings would appear out of nowhere, and the potato bug would make its low, short flight to a new surface. Inevitably, in a way that seemed similarly without volition, I'd reach down, lift one out of the dirt, and pop it in my mouth. Then I'd bite. I liked the crunching sensation and the way its slight vibration felt inside my mouth, just before it died. In retrospect, that was my first deliberate investigation of the natural world. I wasn't hungry, and I wasn't particularly cruel. I was exploring what lay beneath the surface. Most children begin life with that kind of intrepid and voracious appetite, if not for bugs, certainly for knowledge. Curiosity is, without a doubt, the single most powerful psychological mechanism that fuels the acquisition of information. When someone is curious, they learn. It's just about that simple. Which brings us to the paradox I want to discuss today. Why a quality that virtually all babies possess, one that is so powerful, pervasive, and essential to the educational process, dwindles once children get to school. To understand that, I'm a developmental psychologist, I think you need to go back and look at its origins and talk about what happens over time. I'm also going to talk to you about what happens to curiosity when kids get to school. And finally, at the very end, I'll outline what it would take to put curiosity into our classrooms. So why are babies so curious? When my niece Maddie was 11 months old, her mother and I sat her down on the floor next to us so that we could talk and gossip. Next to her, we kept a few small toys, a softball, some small cars, and a little wagon filled with colored wood blocks. She crawled around examining the various toys. She lifted the ball, she tossed it, then she put it away. She got tired of it. She gazed at one of the cars for a few moments and then very carefully put it back on the floor. She carefully stacked 3 of the blocks on top of one another. Seeing that she was happily absorbed, we turned and started to talk. Then suddenly I had that weird maternal feeling that something wasn't right. I don't know if it was the still look on her face or the fact that for once her mouth wasn't moving. I said to my sister, "Something's in there, get it out." And my sister dug her finger into Maddie's mouth and pulled out a really nice, large carpentry staple. Tired of obvious and familiar objects like balls and blocks, my niece had zeroed in on the more fascinating and unfamiliar object lying in the dust on the floor. Too small to manipulate it with her fingers, she had found another really great way to investigate it. Who knows what went on inside there? Perhaps she probed the edges of the staple with her tongue, delicately exploring the sharp edges, or perhaps she was interested in how the weight of it felt in her mouth. Maybe she was waiting to see what we would do when we noticed. Babies are predisposed and well-equipped to impose order and find patterns in the flux of daily experience. That process lies at the heart of cognitive development. In order to find those patterns, though, they must note the difference between what is familiar and what is new or unexpected. This radar for novelty, This radar for novelty is also the key to curiosity, which has been defined alternately as the need to resolve uncertainty or to explain the unexpected. You have to work hard to keep a toddler from exploring the world around them. Jerome Kagan has said that 90% of babies put into a new room will spend about 20 seconds scanning the environment and then dive into exploring it. By the time babies are 16 months, if they're provided even a semblance of coherence and continuity in their everyday lives, they quickly and easily acquire mental scripts which they use to guide their interactions and expectations. For instance, if a baby begins his day by being put in a high chair and getting a sippy cup of orange juice while his mother prepares breakfast, he'll not only organize all his concepts and language around that predictable sequence, he'll also likely show surprise when something different happens. So if he picks the sippy cup up and instead there's hot chocolate in there, or if his mother starts doing the tango instead of cooking the breakfast, he'll be interested. He'll want to watch. He'll want to learn more. Those early scripts provide the basis of cognitive development, and they also provide lots of opportunity for surprise. But at a very early age, human babies show another kind of curiosity, one that other species do not. They have what is called epistemic curiosity, an interest not only in what, who, when, and where, but also why and how. When a baby gazes at an object or bangs it against a hard surface, as they so often do, it's clear that they're trying to take in information about what the object looks like, its shape, its surface, its details, or what it can do, make noise, knock things over. But within the first year, they are just as likely to try and figure out the link between two different actions, say between piling the blocks up and watching the blocks tumble over, or pulling a lever and hearing a sound. The developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik did a wonderful study that showed this. So she brought babies into a lab and put them on one side of a table with a toy on the opposite side of the table, and she gave them a rake. And the idea was whether they'd use the rake to pull the object towards them. Well, in 1 or 2 trials, almost all the babies mastered that. They figured out how to use the rake to bring the toy, and they quickly lost interest in the toy itself. However, they did not lose interest in trying to figure out how it happened that the rake brought the toy towards them. And in fact, they would do that over and over again, often putting the toy farther away in order to further explore the why and the how of that. All of this is to say that young children are curious almost all of the time at this point in development. Curiosity is universal, it's pervasive, and it's resilient. In early childhood, curiosity is a weed. But as children get older, their curiosity becomes less omnivorous and more specific, more narrowly focused. They become less surprised and curious about quotidian life and more surprised by subtleties within a domain. One child's absorbed by how objects are put together, another by bugs, and a third by interactions between people. These specific interests depend on where a child lives, what her aptitudes are for, what she has access to. I raised my kids in a rural area in Massachusetts. Once when my son Sam was little, I took him to New York City to visit the Central Park Zoo. After the birds and the lizards, we came upon an ancient moss-covered tortoise climbing on top of another tortoise and emitting loud, strange moans. The other children's eyes swept across the two lumbering creatures with about the same level of attention they gave to all the other fascinating activity, the brightly colored birds swooping and lighting on the branches, the lizards slithering past. But my 4-year-old son brought a somewhat different perspective with him. He peered in towards the tortoises with a laser-like interest, and after a few moments of careful scrutiny said in a loud, intrigued voice, "I know what they're doing, Mom, they're fucking, right? Is that how tortoises fuck?" I'm worried that I said that word, but whatever. His basic knowledge of animals and his familiarity with zoos freed him to become curious about specific aspects of what he saw. He had seen turtles and tortoises in the wild in the zoo. He wasn't so amazed by that. But he was mystified to see one climb on top of the other and moan. He had a script for zoo. That background knowledge is what allowed him to be surprised about what he saw and want to know more. There was one more notable thing my son did. He asked me about it. Children look, they listen, and they tinker. And these are powerful tools for satisfying curiosity. But by around 24 months, as the example about Sam shows, they acquire an equally powerful tool. They learn to ask questions. In the following conversation, which actually is taken from a fabulous baby diary kept by a couple called the Stearns in 1924, of everything that their 3 children said. But in this sample that I'm going to show you, the mom is talking to her 3-year-old daughter, Hilda. And just follow along with, that's not really Mrs. Stern and Hilda, that's my sister and my niece. They're looking in the book, and Hilda says, "What is he eating?" "Fish." "Why does he eat fish?" "Because he's hungry." "Why doesn't he eat rolls?" "Because we don't give him any." "Why don't we give him any?" "Because bakers only make rolls for people." "Why not for fishes?" "Because they haven't enough flour." "Why then haven't they enough?" "Because not enough corn is grown. You know, don't you, that flour is made out of corn?" "Oh, I see." This is why some psychologists have said that most babies would make great cross-examiners. They don't give up asking until they're satisfied. And it's really important to note that such conversation between preschoolers and their parents is extremely common. In the 1980s, Carol Tizard and Martin Hughes fitted 3-year-olds with small little recording devices and captured each child's language in their home. On average, each child asked 26 questions per hour. And of those questions, 2/3 were to gain information. In the most up-to-date version of this, a woman named Michelle Chouinard analyzed everything that was said by 4 preschoolers over a period of nearly 4 years. Each of the children asked a huge number of questions, as many as 107 per hour. On average, they asked 3 times as many questions aimed at getting new information as they did other kinds of questions. Other kinds of questions like getting permission or gaining clarification. Now, we also know that curiosity is an enormously effective motivation for learning. Studies have shown again and again that when someone's curious about the thing that they're going to learn, they learn a much greater amount, they learn whatever it is much more deeply, and they also remember it far longer. It becomes more permanent. Curiosity is a much more powerful tool for deep learning than is fear of punishment or desire for reward. Given that it's such a powerful mechanism for learning, and given how ubiquitous it is in early childhood, you might expect that at school, where learning is, at least in theory, the central goal, curiosity would be key. But is that true? To find out, my student Prim Asarat and I recorded hours and hours of classroom activity in 5 kindergartens and 5 fifth-grade classrooms. We set out to find out where in the classroom there would be the most curiosity, or whether there'd be more curiosity in kindergarten or in the older classrooms, or whether some children were more curious than others. But actually, that experiment in one way totally failed. We couldn't do the analysis we had intended because we found so little curiosity in any of the classrooms. We counted the number of times children watched something, tinkered, or asked questions, and we calculated how many such episodes there were in each classroom, on average, for about a 2-hour stretch. As you can see from this table, so each of those letters represents one of the classrooms. There was incredible paucity of curiosity anywhere. The all-time high in green for kindergarten was 5.2 episodes per curiosity in a 2-hour stretch. In the high in the 5th grade was 1.40, and in the dismal gray color, in one classroom there was an average 0 numbers of curiosity episodes in a 2-hour stretch. And you should note that this wasn't one child acting curious. These were 23 kids. So many kids were not exhibiting any curiosity at all. I'm not the only one to find such little curiosity in school. Tizard and Hughes, who fitted the kids with the vests, they followed those children at home, but then they followed them to school. And the 26 questions per hour dropped to an average of 2 per hour when the kids were at school. Curiosity may be strong and pervasive in very young children, but by the time kids go to school, it's declined quite dramatically. So why would this be? Because by the time a child is 3 or 4, I think that this is what I'm learning through the evidence I've been collecting. Curiosity has become much more fragile. It begins to wax or wane as a function of the environment. So what exactly are the things that children's curiosity are susceptible to? I'm going to talk about 4. The first is security. John Bowlby was the first one to talk about the importance of attachment, that every baby needs an attachment figure. And his student Mary Ainsworth developed this into an experimental paradigm. You may know this paradigm, called the strange situation paradigm. So you bring a baby into a room with his or her mom, and you have some toys on the floor, and in some versions of the experiment you may have an unfamiliar adult. And you watch them playing together. Then the mom gets up and leaves the room, and you watch the baby's reaction. Now, if there are any grandparents in the room or babysitters, we're used to thinking that it's terrific for a baby not to cry when they go to a stranger. But actually, a securely attached baby will cry, will protest when their mom leaves the room, and that's a really healthy sign of attachment. But that's not the end of the study. Then they watch to see what happens when the mom comes back into the room. And this is the part that's key to noting what kind of attachment the mom and the baby have. So securely attached babies will look at their mom with, overjoyed. They'll run over to her, they'll snuggle her, they might nuzzle with her for a minute. And then, having gotten the reassurance and comfort they want, they'll happily return to exploring the toys. But some babies, the insecurely attached babies, have trouble settling down after the separation. They may greet their mother's return with continued crying. They may look angry at her or pinch her or show other kinds of distress. More importantly, though, for my purposes, they may return to playing. Though they may return to playing, they have trouble concentrating. They're so distracted by worrying that she might leave or by their anger at her for having left that they never again get really fully engaged in the play or the toys. The quality of a child's attachment has a powerful influence on the vigor and depth of her exploration of the world around her. Those children worried or in some way uncertain about the bond they have with their mother are much less likely to make physical and psychological expeditions to gather information. This connection between security and exploration lasts, too. In one study, they gauged children's security, attachment security at 2, and then brought the children back into the lab when they were 4. This time, each child was invited into a room where there was a box with some interesting toys. The babies who had been rated as securely attached when they were 2 were much more likely and much quicker to approach the box and begin exploring with the toys, whereas children who had been rated as insecurely attached at 2 took longer and were much more hesitant to explore the toys. Some of them didn't do it at all. The second thing that children need to express curiosity, and I always hesitate about this one because it's going to sound so obvious at first, is they need to be interested in the things around them. They need to have an opportunity to be curious. Study after study has shown that children are more curious when they interact with things and topics in which they are interested. In one study, toddlers who were given a chance to interact with a toy that they had shown some interest in previously used more gestures to explore it. They explored it longer, and just overall showed a great deal more investigative activity with it. In one experiment, and here I get to the school-age kids a little bit, 4th grade children were put into small groups and asked to learn about a topic. In one condition, they were encouraged to focus on what was ambiguous or controversial about the topic. In the other condition, the groups were asked just to learn the material. Well, lo and behold, after a few days of exposure with this material, the kids who had been invited to focus on ambiguity and controversy had learned the material much more fully than the other children, and they were much more likely to forego a recess time in order to study the topic longer. So it turns out that ambiguity and controversy lead to more learning and to more interest in learning. In another study, similar, students were given nonfiction passages. These were slightly older kids. Nonfiction passages to read. In one condition, the material was conveyed in simple, unadorned prose. I imagine something like a textbook. In a second condition, students read passages covering the same material, but written using more interesting words and sentences. These more opaque passages also contain details that didn't seem strictly relevant to the story or the information being conveyed, what one researcher has called seductive details. When asked to recall what they had learned, the students who had read the interesting, complex, ambiguous material were much more likely to remember it than the children who had been given the transparent, straightforward material. Now that part I want to refer to your own experience, because it's not hard to see why this would be true. And I'm just going to read you quickly two passages of the same material. One is a beginning of a famous piece of psychological theory by George Miller, who was a cognitive psychologist towards the end of his life at Princeton University. And in this paper, he describes his very important and classic idea that human beings remember things in chunks of 7. Now, mind you, this was a scientific article. This is how he opened it. My problem is that I've been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around, has intruded in my most private data, has assaulted me from the pages of our most public journals. This number assumes a variety of disguises, being sometimes a little larger and sometimes a little smaller than usual, but never changing so much as to be unrecognizable. The persistence with which this number plagues me is far more than a random accident. Now compare that, which is just the beginning. So the title of that paper is The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. Here I'm going to read you the version of it that is presented in textbooks. And this is one of the best textbooks that psychology students everywhere encounter. The capacity of working memory is sharply limited. Traditionally, this capacity has been measured by a memory span task, in which the individual hears a series of items and must repeat them in order after just one presentation. In fact, many tasks, not just memory span, show that people have a limit of 7 plus or minus 2 items, leading psychologists to refer to it as the magic number. Well, which would you rather read? Turns out that everybody likes seductive details. When my students and I went into classrooms to observe curiosity, we found that though there wasn't much, the place where we saw the most was where kids lingered to watch something that was changeable, dynamic, unexpected. The most common place was the aquarium, where they would see things that they couldn't predict and that no one had told them to study. And they watched what the fish did, and they watched what the algae did. And I think that's suggestive of something about, I'm going to end with that, about what it is that attracts kids' curiosity in a classroom setting. The environmental psychologist Roger Hart has argued that this is why children need natural, messy places to play, rather than the sort of neat, pristine, structured environments that very affluent schools provide their kids, because they need dynamic, unexpected activity. Now, some materials, objects, and environments are more interesting because they're richer and more complex. But in addition, not all children are interested in the same things. And this sounds so obvious as to be trite, but it's often disregarded. For children to develop their curiosity, they need to have access to the particular things that interest them. And also, as I'll say later, that's true in school just as it is at home. The third incredibly potent influence on children's curiosity is the response of adults. To begin with, think back to the example of Hilda and her mother. It wasn't just that Hilda asked a lot of questions, it's that her mother kept answering, that she tolerated all of those questions. It turns out that how parents respond and teachers respond is incredibly important. And I'll stop here to say that in one of the many observations I did in a high school classroom, I watched this social studies teacher presenting a lesson. It was pretty interesting. The kids were listening, and suddenly this 10th grader's hand shot up, and the teacher said, "No, Allie, save your questions for later. This is time for learning." And I see this a lot. I see this all the time. How am I doing for time? Good? Okay. Just to give some experimental evidence for the importance of adult response, Bruce Henderson created something called a curiosity box. It's a wood box. It's got drawers on every side, and inside each drawer is an anomalous little object. He put the box into a lab room, an empty room, and invited kids one by one to come in and watch to see how quickly they'd approach the box, how many drawers they'd open, how many of the objects they'd manipulate, and what they'd do with the objects. But some of the kids, when they came in, the adult in the room would smile or nod or say, "Oh, that's interesting." In a second condition, the adult would remain impassive, say nothing, just quietly sit. And in a third condition, the adult would frown or shake their head or might even say a mildly constraining thing like, "Oh, be careful." Lo and behold, kids were much more likely to examine the box, to play with the objects, to open things, to try things out with the objects when they had an encouraging adult in the room. Now, my student Hillary Hackman and I decided we wanted to see if this was true in classrooms as well, because a lab is one thing, but the noisy, messy environment of a classroom is another. And the question was, would one teacher have that big of an impact on all the kids in a room of 23? And we created our own curiosity box. We brought it into first grade and third grade classrooms and watched to see what would happen, who would approach the box and who wouldn't. We found enormous difference, not by virtue of age, but by virtue of the teacher, which classroom the box was in, and whether the teacher was nodding. The teachers didn't know what the purpose of the study was, whether the teacher was nodding and smiling or made encouraging comments or not. So that's just some of the evidence, there's actually quite a lot, that adults have a huge impact on children's expression of curiosity. And whenever I think about this, I think, it doesn't seem like such big news that teachers influence children's behavior. But the finding does contradict our common assumption that some children are simply more curious than others and that curiosity is safe at school. Children don't explore when teachers don't encourage it. And here's a really important caveat, especially if there are any teachers in the room. It's not the case that nice teachers encourage curiosity and mean teachers do not. Years ago, when I began first to notice this incredible paucity of curiosity in classrooms, I began to wonder why. Why would that be, since I knew that children were still quite curious, or at least some of the children. And I had seen lots of really nice teachers and skilled teachers and adept teachers in all my observations, so I didn't think that's what it was. I had a hunch that it had to do with what they thought should be going on in the classroom. So my student Kelly Randall and I decided to test this. We invited teachers into our lab to help us with a study about how children learn. That's what they thought the study was about. We told each teacher we wanted them to do a science activity called bouncing raisins, you may have seen it online, with a child who would be joining them in the lab. The activity involves mixing certain liquids and other ingredients in a beaker and then dropping a raisin into the liquid. The interaction of the liquids causes little bubbles to form on the raisin, and the raisin pops to the top. We gave each teacher all the materials, some background information so they would feel knowledgeable, and a worksheet to follow and fill out with the child when the child entered. Okay, here's the twist. In fact, the teachers were the subjects in our study, and the children who came to work with them were our Confederates. The children were trained to participate each time as if it was their first time, and halfway through the activity, they would suddenly do something unexpected. They would take a Skittle instead of a raisin and drop it into the liquid. We were interested in how the teachers would respond to such a deviation. And note, it wasn't an obstreperous deviation. They weren't kicking somebody. They weren't trashing everything. They were just doing something that might lead them to learn something new. And in fact, if the teacher asked the child what she was doing, each child was trained to say, "I just wanted to see what would happen." However, there's one more twist to the study. Not all the teachers were given the same instruction. So half the teachers, when they came in, we said, "We want you to do this activity, fill out this worksheet. We want you to help children learn more about science." And as we left the lab, we'd say, have fun learning about science. The other half of the teachers, when they came into the room, we said, here's the materials, here's the stuff, here's the kid. We want you to help this child fill out the worksheet. And as we left the lab, we said to those teachers, have fun filling out the worksheet. Turns out, I don't know if this is going to be a surprise or not at this point in the talk, that there was a huge difference by virtue of which condition they were in how they responded when the child dropped the Skittle in the liquid. Teachers who had been told, have fun learning about science, were likely to respond by saying things like, oh, that's cool, well, how'd you think of that? Or, oh, you want to drop something else in there? Teachers who had been told, have fun filling out the worksheet, that was the only difference in the instruction the teachers were given, were very likely to say things like, oh, don't do that, that's not on the instructions. So what we learned from that is that teachers are incredibly susceptible to their mindset, their idea of what the activity is, what the purpose of the activity is. And I'm going to return to this because I think it's important to remember this is not about good teachers and bad teachers. This is about what people think should be going on in a classroom. Okay, I'm going to talk about one final influence on children's curiosity, which is role models. We wanted to find out how much it mattered how a teacher behaved in not only in what they said, but what they did in encouraging children's curiosity. So we decided to flip the bouncing raisins activity on its head. Maddie LaBella, a student of mine, and I brought children into the lab. This time the children really were the subjects, and she acted as the teacher experimenter. Each child came in and did the bouncing raisins activity with her and filled out a worksheet. It was almost exactly the same as the previous experiment. But this time, about halfway through the activity, Maddie suddenly dropped, she was, in the teacher role, dropped a Skittle into the liquid and said, I know this isn't on the worksheet, but I really want to know what will happen. And then for half the children, she didn't say that, she just tidied up the materials a little bit. That was the control condition. At the end of the activity, she said to each child, look, I have to go out and get some more materials for another fun activity. I'm going to leave you here. Do whatever you like. You can play more with the materials, but if you don't want to, you can draw, or you can just hang out. I'll be back in a few minutes. And she left the room and left the camera running. And we watched to see what the children would do after she left. Sure enough, kids who had seen her do something unexpected and try to find out more about the materials were much more likely to look at the materials, to fiddle with them, to talk to themselves and try to explain what was going on. Whereas the other children who had seen her just tidy up would stand there like this. Sometimes they sang to themselves. One kid played with a zipper quite a bit, but they didn't explore the materials. And what we learned from that is that it's not just what teachers say to children, it's the amount of inquiry and curiosity they exhibit themselves. Okay, to sum up, children are born curious, and here's the rub. Though curiosity grows like a weed in infancy, it becomes much more fragile as children grow up. Meanwhile, we know it's this incredibly powerful fuel for learning, and yet what we're seeing is that schools, however unwittingly, are drastically diminishing rather than cultivating this enormously powerful fuel. So what would a classroom look like where curiosity was deliberately fostered? First, classrooms would be filled with interesting, complex material rather than simple didactic material, rather than material designed to get the message across or get the information in. Second, teachers would spend a lot more time inviting kids to ask questions rather than leading them through questions to deliver or exhibit the material or information they think the children should know. And here is a little bit of heresy. It's the opposite of the Socratic method. And I'm going to show you why with one example. So this is, well, I don't want you to read it before I tell you. This is a classroom where a teacher brought in a baggie with some liquid and algae and some fish into a classroom, a really nice classroom, a kindergarten classroom, and brought the kids around to sit near the aquarium so she was going to do a little lesson about what was in the baggie. And this is the conversation they had. And I don't think I have time to go through the whole thing, but I'll start. What do you think's in here? What is this stuff? I know what it is, says a child. I know, it's a allergy. It's an algae eater, not an allergy eater, but an algae eater. Who knows what algae is? It's like stuff that gets on there. Yep. Now, is that dirt? What is it? Some people do have allergies. That's true. Like allergies on a fish tank. Some people do. That's true. What's in it? What is this stuff? What actually is it? Allergies. It's algae, yes, but is it dirt? No. Is it, what is it? It's like sand. Am I on the next page? No. Same idea, but it's something else. Is it an animal? No. No. Is it alive? No. Yeah. Yep, it's plants. It's teeny, teeny, tiny plants. So I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to go to the end. She's asking them about carnivores and the difference between carnivores and herbivores. And she says, why don't our two Oscars, two fishes, eat this? And that's where they talk about it. And at the end, the kid says, are they called Oscarosaurs? The teacher continues with what she's saying, and the kid says, but can there be an Oscarosaur? Can there be an algaeosaur? Now, what's striking to me about this example is that it's lively, it's hands-on, all the things we think of as the trappings of a good classroom. But almost all the questions are being asked by the teacher. Almost none of the questions are asked by the children. And when they are asked by the children, she doesn't spend any time talking about it. If children are to further develop their curiosity, they need many chances to ask questions. And they also need to learn how to pursue those questions, how to figure out what kinds of information they need and what kinds of activity they need to do to get the answers they want. One final part to that, they need to figure out when they've answered their question and when they haven't. They need to learn how to assess that for themselves. Administrators need to emphasize exploration, not completion of tasks. Teachers depend on their superintendents and their principals to provide a clear sense of what should be at the center of the educational process. Last but not least, for children to go on expanding their curiosity in school, they need to be around curious adults. Teachers should spend a lot of their professional development figuring out what they are curious about and then pursuing that curiosity. To teach inquiry, you have to be engaged in inquiry yourself. And I was talking with someone last night. I've revised that sentence since last night. It's not only in professional development that needs to happen. That should be at the heart of teacher education, teaching future teachers how to develop and pursue their curiosity. All of this begins with understanding that for children to hold on to and deepen their curiosity, as well as their tools for satisfying that curiosity, it's got to be at the center of the classroom. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be something we think some kids have and other kids don't have, or icing on the cake, the thing that happens after they've learned whatever it is we really want them to learn. It has to be the goal. I would like to see a day, and I don't think it has to be very far off, where instead of measuring how many division problems a kid can do at the end of the year and holding teachers accountable for that, we hold teachers accountable for how many expressions of curiosity there are in their classroom. I think that would be a much more interesting thing to hold people accountable to, and a much more interesting way to measure what it is we really want kids to acquire in school. Okay, I'm going to end with this. It's probably my only chance to correct Einstein, so I'm going to enjoy myself. He said, curiosity is a delicate little plant which, aside from stimulation, stands mainly in need of freedom. Einstein was only partly right. Curiosity is delicate, but it needs more than freedom and stimulation. This particular and vital little plant needs a lot of cultivation. Okay, done with that part of the talk. So, questions? Yes. That man with the orange t-shirt.
First of all, the talk was fascinating. Being trained as a stainless steel Skinnerian psychologist,
Oops.
The question I would have is, when you're doing your research, how do you differentiate between looking at children who have a high need for social reinforcement and it might appear as curious behavior versus pure curious behavior?
Well, it's a great question, and I want to say right now that this is a very hard area to do research in because of the gap, or the possible gap, between what people do and what they're feeling and thinking inside. And the evidence of how hard it is to do research on this is that there's almost no research on it. That's fun for me. I got a lot to do. But there isn't a really sizable, robust body of evidence. Part of it, though, comes from the fact that a lot of times children are engaging in this kind of exploration when no one's giving them any kind of feedback at all. There are plenty of experiments, including some of our own, like when the kid is alone in the room with the video camera on, where they're expressing curiosity and no one's, as far as they know, no one's looking. Yeah. I'm going for orange here, orange pants.
Let's say children go through elementary school, high school, and college. The most important thing for them to do is perform well, get good grades. They now graduate, they're going into the world, they don't know about themselves, they don't know what they like or want, and they've completely seemed to have lost curiosity. Can it be rekindled?
Oh boy, I think so. I think it's, but I don't have a lot of evidence yet on this. I was giving a talk last year in Singapore, and a man came up to me who lived in Singapore and said, "Do you think this can be reignited in college?" And it turned out he taught at some satellite school of MIT, I believe. And I don't have the answer to that question. We do know that it can be sort of encouraged. We've seen from many studies that small changes in the environment and the way adults respond can increase the number of expressions of curiosity that children engage in. How long that window is, whether it lasts till college, well, my answer to that is, why would we ever wait till kids got to college to change things? So as someone interested in kids, I would say the safe answer is start cultivating it early on. But we don't really know the answer to how old a person can be to have their curiosity reignited. I think that's one way of putting it. Yes?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Susan, has there been, that was a wonderful talk, thank you.
Thanks.
Has there been any significant research on unstructured play and curiosity? Because increasingly kids' time is becoming so structured. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
So it's a really good question, and it brings up another thing that makes curiosity really hard to do research on, which is it's not always easy to tell the difference, to make a decision as a researcher about what's creativity and what's curiosity, and they're not the same thing. They may be very related, but they're not exactly the same thing. And some of you can think of examples of times when you were trying to make something more beautiful, whether it was music or art or a piece of writing, but you weren't trying to also learn new things. I mean, that's a sort of strict definition. That said, the same kind of activity that encourages creativity is also the kind of activity that encourages curiosity, a freedom to follow a hunch, to keep trying something over and over again, to do something unconventional that was unscripted, like drop the skittle. I mean, that's mild. So there's no direct evidence on that question, but to the extent that we know that freedom is one of the conditions of pursuing your curiosity, it's the same as the freedom that leads to various kinds of creativity. I'm actually, in this book I have yet to title, I'm going to write a chapter on boredom and loneliness and the way in which they're conducive to curiosity, because I think sort of unstructured time and space is probably really important. Yes? How are you supposed to do this? Identify what the person's wearing? The person with the black and white pattern. Yeah, that's you.
I have a question that may well be out. I'm sorry.
No, go. It's good. It's good. You both have black and white patterns.
I'm so sorry. Right. I have a question that is probably way out of the scope of your research, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it. I think there are real consequences of lack of curiosity.
Real what?
Real consequences of lack of curiosity in adult behavior.
Yep.
Specifically, the area I study, foreign policy, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, but I honestly think that one of what people already have said that going into the Iraq War was the greatest foreign policy mistake. I think that had so much to do with a lack of curiosity, that not asking questions. And I don't know if that's at all part of your
very much so.
Research, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's part of my research yet, but it's part of my thinking. And actually, I've been very aware of it while I've been here at the Aspen Ideas Festival, because I've gone to some of the foreign policy and sort of politically based talks. And one of the things I'm really struck by, and I've thought this a lot in the past, is that we suffer terribly as adults for not having a love of evidence, not having an interest in finding out more information before we make up our minds. And I don't say that glibly, because it's hard to change your mind, and it's hard to pay attention to disconfirming evidence as an adult. I haven't changed my mind many times, a few times about really important things as an adult. And I invite people to think about that. When was the last time they changed their mind about something and changed it in response to incoming information? So I totally agree with you. I think part of it is the curiosity to get information, especially disconfirming information. So like, read the columnist you never agree with. If you think, I mean it. I mean, I do that. Read the book that you think says the thing that you already had decided you knew what you thought about. Because otherwise, we're no more open to new evidence than the people whose minds we want to change. Yes, the other person with the black and white.
No, I'm just curious about your thoughts on the impact of technology. I have young children, and while I used to be out in the forest exploring things, I see my own kids wanting to be in front of a tablet or a video game, or just curious about your thoughts.
Sure, so I have a double answer. The first part is, there are other researchers, developmental psychologists in this room who may know better than I, but I think we don't know yet very much about the impact of various kinds of technology, and those technologies are not all the same either, so they're different types. So I don't really know in terms of evidence. However, I will add one thing to this that's somewhat more personal, which has to do with Google. I actually think Google is totally awesome, and I love looking things up, and I've noticed that people here keep looking things up during the lectures, and it's cool. They're not Facebooking like my students do during class or buying shoes. They are, I've seen that. I've banned laptops from my classroom, and my class is much better now that I've done that. But the people here, you good students, are looking up words you didn't know or studies you weren't familiar with. And I read a piece in the Times, and I'm embarrassed to say I forget his name, but I called him, I loved it so much, an historian who talked about what he called research rapture, which some of us know very well what that feels like. You start reading about something, and then suddenly you have to look up this reference or this idea or this line of research. And I actually think that to the extent that certain kinds of technology allow us to get lots of information, particularly when it's going deeper and deeper, rather than skimming the surface and there's some research on this in the curiosity world about the difference between specific and diversive curiosity, wanting more and more, like my son wanted to know more and more about those you-know-what tortoises. I should say he's studying biology now, so that led to a good place. So I don't really have a good empirical answer for you, but I actually think people should not be quick to dismiss it as the evil alternative to playing in the woods. It may be the contemporary version of playing in the woods. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
So this is really powerful stuff, and I'm very affected by it. One thing you didn't speak much about that I'd love your insight on is the effect of the way that peers sort of discourage curiosity in the room. I know, like, as a teacher now, and as someone who was the weird kid as a boy, I'm very observant to the way that children who are creative or curious are sometimes dampened by judgments and things of that sort.
Well, that's very interesting, and actually I would like to know more about that. That's a very interesting flip perspective. I'll tell you two things. In the study we did with the curiosity box in the classroom, we expected the older kids to display less curiosity than the younger kids, because that's what a lot of research has suggested. And we did not find that to be so, and then we realized why. Because in the classroom environment, unlike the lab where the previous research had been done, kids could go up to the box in groups. And it turned out that by the time you're in third grade, often you express your curiosity when you're with a peer. So in some cases, but not all clearly, peers actually are conducive to curiosity. I just finished working with a wonderful young student named Dan Silver, just did his honors thesis at Williams, And we did an experiment looking at whether very curious kids could infect less curious kids by putting them together in a setting where they got to play some things together and do some interesting activities, talk about a little segment of, what's that, Planet Earth? Is that what it's called? Yeah. And in fact, we found that children who originally had been rated as being very incurious became much more curious over time when they were allowed to interact with other kids. So that's one, from my perspective, one part of this is that actually social interaction can be conducive to curiosity. Clearly not all the time, or you wouldn't have the experience you had had. So I think that's really worth looking at more closely. Thanks. Yes. One more question. Oh, okay. Yes, that person.
Thanks very much for this talk. A lot of what you talked about is familiar to us in terms of kids constantly asking multiple questions, but something that seems contrary to what you talked about, but we're also all familiar with, is a child who likes to watch the same video over and over and over again. So why do children like that? Because it seems your focus is very much on familiarity as being a boring thing, but we also know that kids are really drawn to the same thing over and over again. How does that mesh with your research?
Okay, well, unsurprisingly, I'm going to give you a complicated answer. First of all, people do things for a lot of reasons, and sometimes kids look at the same thing over and over again because it's comforting or because they're eager to master it in some way. You know, my son watched 101 Dalmatians about 20,000 times to memorize it. But I will add one thing. We know, and this is what I was trying to say in the early part of the talk, that as children gain more knowledge about certain domains, what surprises them becomes more and more subtle, which is why some of us are still curious about the topics we began studying, 30 years ago. Because the more you know about it, the more there is to know, and the more fine-grained your appetite for knowledge becomes. I can't give a pat answer about why one particular kid watches the same video over and over again, but I do think that in our current school system...
No, we haven't. We're running slightly behind.
The school system is an enemy to depth. And for all that I believe in the power of curiosity, that does not stand in contrast to spending a lot of time with something. A person can be very curious about something that they spend a great deal of time on. And in fact, by the time they get to college, we hope that they are capable of sustained inquiry over a long period of time. That's our goal. I think we have to end. Thank you very much.